Good evening, everyone. This is our Theology Thursday on the 3rd of March, and we're joined by Corin from Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries. I'm going to pass over to Corin. He's going to talk a little bit about his background and what he's going to be talking to us about tonight. We are recording, so if people want to turn off the video cameras, that's fine.
Thanks so much, Lizzie. It's really great to be with you this evening. And I feel that every time I get a chance to talk about well-being during this time of the pandemic, it feels like a really important conversation to have. And I think one of the reasons for that, from my perspective, is that it's been harder for us to have those moments where we've been able to check in, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the level of change and challenge to our well-being in this time has been really unusual. So having an opportunity like this to offer a bit of content around the subject and also to kind of open up a bit of a conversation around it is really important. So, I think it's great that we're doing this, and a particular kind of welcome to anyone who's going to be watching this film. I hope that there'll be some things in here that will be useful for you. Outside of the conversation, we're going to be running through a few reflective exercises together. So at some point you might find you want a bit of time, press pause while you're doing that. But the whole purpose of this time this evening is to essentially try and help us find, get a bit of a story for ourselves around what's happened in the pandemic for us, do some reflecting on kind of broadly the impact on our communities, really find out where we are right now before then thinking forward and planning and considering what we need for our well-being in this particular time. Now, the thing that's been common throughout this 2-year period is that there's been a lot of change, and it's relatively recently that we've hit this place of stability. So as we start to exhale a bit, I think new opportunities arise. So really I come with that kind of hope that we'll be able to kind of root ourselves down for where we are at the moment and then start to look forward as we go ahead. So that's a bit of an overview of what my plan is for this evening. And briefly, I came to do this work really. I took a pretty circuitous route. I spent 20 years working with homeless people, and that connected me with people who were often living with quite challenging histories of trauma, people who were often substance dependent, but incredible resilience of spirit. And I saw sort of both the best and the worst of so many things within that situation, and people who were finding their way to survive. And that, without doubt, that immersed me in a really a deep interest in how we flourish as human beings. And by the time I came to lead this work with Sanctuary, it was the pandemic. And so I found myself in August 2020 of starting this work. So just very briefly, Sanctuary is a charity that's based in the UK, and we have a parent charity who are based in Canada. And so they've kind of blazed the trail over the work that we do. And our particular focus and interest is supporting churches, faith communities around their mental health awareness, and really seeing mental health as something that's not just for a crisis moment. It's not just for those times when we're in difficulty, but really it's something for all of us to be paying attention to and reflecting on. And for us, that means that we want to do that through a kind of Christian lens, and we also want to use good teaching from psychology, and we want to share experiences as well of people with lived experience. So there's quite a lot really that we really want to achieve with the church. It's very much helping people get on board with that conversation, so churches can be safe places and can start to, I think, lead the way around being communities where there's a good level of awareness and safety around our mental health challenges. So that's kind of a bit about me. I'll share a bit more as we go within the content that we're doing. Is it all right for me to just kick off, or does anyone need to kind of say anything else at this point? No, that's great. Well, we've done the intro, so we'll get on with the bulk of what we're doing this evening. So we've called tonight Disrupted Rhythms, a Hopeful Path Through Pandemic Wellbeing. And now the purpose of the session is really around thinking quite, I would say, specifically around the context of the pandemic. Now, our well-being always happens in a context. In a way, that's a truism, isn't it? There's always stuff going on around us, but there can be things that impact which are beyond our personal circumstances. And obviously the pandemic is one of those times when that's been a big thing. What I'd like to do, I'm going to just invite you to just a short exercise. And what I'm hoping to do in this is just bring us into the present of the here and now in terms of where we're at as we sit here this evening thinking about this topic. And so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to identify what I'm going to call your internal weather. Okay, so I'd like you to have a think about if what you were feeling was weather, what would that be? I like this because it's broad. You know, it can be quite polarized. It could be sunny, it could be raining, but there could be a whole mix of those things. There could be, you know, wintry showers involved. So just give yourself a moment to have a think about, okay, today, right now, as I sit here, what's my internal weather looking like? Okay, so if also, I just want to say, if these kind of pictures and metaphors don't work with you, don't worry, because we'll be doing other things that aren't quite so metaphorical. There'll be some things that are a bit more factually based as well. So I know that not everything lands, and there'll be some things that land for you and other things that don't. So either way, don't be concerned. But it's just a way of just us trying to be present to what's going on for us right now. Because any time we look at this question of well-being, we're always bringing whatever's happening in the moment. And so if we can acknowledge where we are as we look at it, it can really help us as we engage. So that's why I've offered us to do that as we've started to look at this. Right, I'm going to share a couple of slides, I think. So let's see if this will work. Hopefully it will. If I okay, I think I might need to be enabled to share for us to do that, if that's possible. So that'll just take a moment. I'll just talk for a minute while that's happening. So what we're going to be doing in a moment is I just want to kind of set a bit of a theme for where we are. Brilliant. Looks like the slides are going to work, which is great. Thank you. Just a moment, if I can find them. Just a minute. I've just, there we go. I just had the wrong thing up. It's fine. We can edit this out, I'm sure. Great. So here we go. Just something to start up with. So that's that's Sanctuary and us. Oops, start from here. Wonderful. And here's a little quote I just want to share. Oh, we're loading. Ah, perfect. Great. So this is from Henry Nouwen. And I just want to share this because I think it's a helpful thing. The truly good news is that God is not a distant God, but a God who is moved by our pain and participates in the fullness of the human struggle. So it's an awareness that God has a deep interest in our well-being. And I think at a time like this, as we think about where we're at in our journey, this season of Lent, if that's something you observe within your tradition, this time of taking stock is very much a part of what we're looking at this evening. And in the midst of that challenge, as it were, that invitation to take stock, our Lent is, of course, very much coloured by a war on our doorstep. So there are people's choices around their well-being that are based on survival. And we're obviously in a position where we're trying to make choices that are around our flourishing, you know, but we're very aware as we sit in this space of how that sits in terms of, you know, we've got this massive polarity of experience in our world at this moment. And just in the same way in the pandemic, there's been enormous polarity too. So we're going to touch on that in a moment. But I just wanted to ground us a bit with Henry Nouwen. He's someone I often return to as someone who just seems to have really deep spiritual wisdom and a deep understanding and experience of a loving God, you know, one that is there for us and with us and alongside us. Now, really quickly, quick word on self-care for this session. There will be a few invitations to share and some of your experience if that feels relevant. And if you choose to share, thanks for that, because it's something that I'm sure other people will relate to. But I don't want anyone to feel under pressure to share anything at all. And particularly we're being recorded, so it's just good to be mindful of that as we go through this journey together. So, one of the things that I would say is a particularly incredible thing, it's not unique to humans, but we do have it, and that's our adaptability. And we've seen lots of that throughout the pandemic. And for many of us, we've had incredibly different experiences of our lives than we'd expected. Now, I'm expecting a lot of people who are going to be looking at this. I say a lot. I mean, that's fairly ambitious, isn't it? Expectant. Well, hopefully some of your other members who look at this will have had a very different experience of education as they've gone through this period of the pandemic than perhaps they expected if they've started their study during this time. There've been many other things that have really been incredibly challenging within this period that we know, and that these, some of them, it feels like it's been a long time since we've discussed, for example, homeschooling, lockdown, the idea of only being able to go out once a day unless you were helping somebody. All of these things might seem already quite distant memories to us, even though that, as you look on a calendar, they're not that far away, really. Now, the thing is, during this pandemic, and particularly during this lockdown time, there was a particular aspect of our well-being that was impacted by the fact that many of us had entered what you would call a survival state. Okay, so this is a physiological reaction to changes and challenges in our environment. And what tends to happen is that we just focus on what's before us. And you might remember yourself just that experience of kind of having to let go of any plans, and every day feeling quite mundane and monotonous, and all of our energy focused on that day often and rarely beyond it. So that was very much an experience that many of us have been through to a greater or lesser extent. Now, the sign that we're probably coming out of a survival state is that we tend to start planning more. And we plan further ahead, and we probably plan with the expectation that things are going to happen rather than, well, it's in the diary, but really, which is, I think, probably an experience that many of us had during this time. And what I found was, it's interesting lately, I do quite a lot of chatting with people around these experiences. And I was in a room with a group of people talking about mental health in the pandemic, 70 people. And I'd said within the pandemic, of course, the majority of us have experienced real difficulty and challenge to one degree or another. But there's another group, possibly between maybe 7 and 10% of people have reported improved well-being during this time. And so we did a bit of group work on it, and we chatted about it. And a group of 3 people came back to me and said, we really want to contest what you were saying about that 7 to 10%. We kind of find that hard to believe it's true, because we've all had a really good time. And I was kind of amazed by that. But what was very interesting, another corrective came in from someone who's on the front row. And he said, my experience has been the opposite. He said, the first run of the pandemic, we lost a number of people in our community and we were grieving them. And then the second run of the pandemic, we lost even more people. And so he said, we're still grieving. And so just within that little frame, we get this idea of a very diverse experience that we've been through. And again, through that, it's going to impact our well-being in very different ways. So what I'd be really interested in now is, if you would be up for it, those that are online at the moment, I'd be really interested if you could pick a word or a sentence to summarize your experience. And bear in mind, there might be children viewing. So, but just advisedly kind of pick your words as well as you can. So if you want to pitch in, and Mike, I'd love to hear if you can think of it. We'll just give you a moment to think about what that might be. Anyone want to pitch in with something?
I can go. I would say stormy. I don't know if that's just because I'm thinking about that weather question at the start, but
the weather guided you.
But yeah,
stormy. So stormy. Quite variable and dramatic.
Yeah. variable and dramatic, I think, is exactly the way to kind of summarize it.
Good. Thank you. Great. Would anyone else like to go?
Yeah, I think for me it would be unknown, and just like the constant like anxiety of not knowing what's next, or where this is going to, like what direction it's going to go in.
Yes. Yeah. That uncertainty was huge for many of us, wasn't it? Some people seem quite good at day to day, but I found myself to be quite a planner, as it turns out. You know, I didn't quite realize how much. Great.
I think
Great.
also like,
Alana,
I think it's also about keeping busy when there feels like there's nothing actually to do. Like right at the beginning of the pandemic, I was at uni in my third year, so that was sort of fine. I could use it to distract myself. And then suddenly uni was done, and I was like, now what? Now what do I do? Kind of thing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So we've got quite diversity of different words there, but there's something in common with it, of kind of the sense of, I don't know, maybe quite a destabilizing experience for many of us. Yeah, so some nods coming through there. So thank you. So I've been thinking a bit about this idea of kind of being in a survival space during the pandemic. And I wanted to share something, which is an image from the Bible, that I think taps into survival mode, perhaps in a way that we've experienced it. So here's just a slide. So this is an image of something from Exodus 13. And when the Israelites had left Egypt, in order for them to be reminded of God's presence, he would, in the day, he would provide this cloud of smoke, and the evening it would be a pillar of fire. And it's a really obvious and clear sign that he is with them. And what really struck me about that is that they don't know how long they're going to be there. They can't see the future ahead of them. And there's something about the fact that they were comforted by this. This was a constant reminder in this time of uncertainty, in the wilderness period, that it really struck me that many of us needed that level of comfort, you know, during this time of the pandemic, that day to day, within that period of uncertainty, when no horizon was clear, I felt like we collectively, the daily comfort was important. And for some of us, there might be a deep sense of being destabilized spiritually as well during this time. But also, I think this kind of recognition that within, if we take this image as something that we could draw from, of this sense in which God's presence, which in this situation was visible in that way, sort of needing that reassurance if we can't plan ahead, if there is no horizon, almost, that we kind of all needed a bit of that kind of pillar and fire and smoke. And I wonder for all of us where we might be at right now, if we think about these images. On the one hand, this kind of the cloud of smoke and the pillar of fire as a kind of symbol of comfort and the kind of need for enough for now. And then if we think of a horizon developing, and particularly maybe a hopeful future, which obviously in this case was the promised land, I wonder where we might place ourselves on a scale from one to another, if it's possible for me to kind of construct that. And you don't need to answer that question specifically, but just check in with yourself, kind of where am I at right now? Does it feel like I'm still in that survival space actually? Don't judge that. It's just that might be where you are. Or does it feel like the horizon's kind of emerging? Or actually the way I'm behaving now feels very much like the horizon is there and present. So it's just a way of just you situating yourself right now as you think about where you are, as we've come out this time of survival, and just a way of locating where we are in our experience. So I just offer that to you. Now we're going to do a little bit more work on this as we unpack our pandemic experience. Now, the period of time that we've been in, a number of people are now starting to refer to as one of collective trauma. Now, it's an interesting phrase, and in a sense, just a brief descriptor. It's a time in our society where we've all been touched by a level of disruption and difficulty. And the thing, of course, within something like this, we won't be equally impacted. Some of us will have been through some very tough things, and others, we're sort of thinking, well, actually, we've been on the edge of that very much. But the idea, of course, is that we're all in the ripples of it, you know, and equally as we experience a collective trauma, there will be also the need for a collective recovery. So I just want to share a slide with you that gives a bit of a description, or maybe a picture of some of the things that may be resonant in terms of our pandemic experience. So here we are. Now, this complexly titled Emotional Phases of Disaster. Some of you, if you've been involved in development and relief work, might have seen something like this before. But this is a picture really that's either when war has impacted a community, or where there's been a natural disaster. This is the usual route of recovery following that event or series of events. And what was interesting to me when I came across it, and there's not an exact overlay, as we'll see as we go through it, but there are certain things within it that may kind of also parallel our experience of COVID. So warning and threat, we'll probably remember the times when we had these kind of news warnings of what was going on in China, and thinking, probably many of us thinking, well, sorry for them, but I'm glad that's not coming here, you know. And then very quickly, a few months later, started to shift. And this heroic phase, and I don't know whether any of you encountered this kind of everyone kind of rallying together. I got involved in a local mutual aid group here and found myself meeting neighbours I'd never met before. It's, this is brilliant, you know. That was that stage. And I don't know, does that chime with people, that kind of early, yeah, we're getting lots of nods there. And again, for some people that may not have shifted very much, because you know, their life may not change. If you're in a remote, more rural community, I don't think anyone on the call is quite in that space, but you may not have found yourself so disrupted in the way that many others were. But of course, as we found ourselves out of that time of kind of rallying together, and then hitting more challenges, and lockdown, and then not lockdown, and then Christmas, and then not Christmas, and all of these things, and this period of disillusion very much kicked in. And after that, it gets sketchier. I don't want to pinpoint where I think we are. We may not be anywhere at the end of that. And but the thing that we can say is that there have been a number of impacts. And so there's probably no linear route out of this. But it's just a way of kind of helping, once again, thinking about, for a lot of us, I think we've often wondered, is what I'm experiencing in any way normal? You know, should I be going through this right now? And something like this, I hope, might offer us all a way of finding a bit of a sense of that normality, even in its inexactness, you know, if that makes sense. It's just a way of us helping and think about what's going on there. So I'm just going to stop the slide for a moment, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Kind of interesting to often think about how we respond in these circumstances, and our different coping strategies will be all very varied depending on kind of our upbringing and depending on our context and what's available to us. And I think that one of the things that I still am finding present throughout this time, and I don't know if this is relevant here, but a lot of people, and I would include myself in this, is asking the question of, why am I still so tired? It's gone on for so long. And it's the normal response, actually, of our nervous system that's been overwhelmed over quite a long period, and the various disruptions that have come with that. So I'm going to talk a bit more about those disruptions shortly. But something I want to offer, I think something that I've been starting to see is less of this conversation of kind of, when do we return to normal? And what I've been offering, I suppose, is the question of, well, what choices can I make that will help me live well in this season as I see it? So we're kind of letting go of that idea gradually, and maybe there's a grief in that of, you know, what has gone, and we're not quite sure what new looks like, but we know that things really have changed, rather than, oh, we'll be back to where we were. Does that resonate with people? Is that something that I'd love it if you commented on just anything that came up there in that little bit. Any thoughts on that particular piece?
I think the thing with the graph, for me, the thing that I took away is, I don't know where this would fit, but there was an intense period as well after kind of that community cohesion where I just felt very angry. Not necessarily at anybody, but just I think at the state of the world and I realized it in myself. I was getting angry, and then I did get really tired, and even now I still get really tired. Like, I spend time with friends and people I love, and it's great, but then I'm really tired afterwards. It kind of drains me.
Really helpful to name that. There's a little bit I'm going to pick up on that very thing of that tiredness around socializing, which I think has been quite common. So thank you for naming that, Lizzie. That's great. Any other comments?
Yeah, I think for me it's quite similar to Lizzie, but kind of I feel like a level of like part anxiety, part like interest in what the future is going to be like, and whether we're going to go back to pre-pandemic, the way things were pre-pandemic, or whether we have created a new normal. And like that kind of feeds into then how I'm feeling as an individual. Is like I am feeling way more tired or drained after social interaction. So is that something that's going to carry on, and that's just going to be how things are, or is this just like a period that I will then like come out of because I've not done it for ages?
I'm really glad you've asked that. So I don't want to leave it on too much for a cliffhanger, but there is some content that addresses that very thing in a moment. So that's great. Thanks so much. So what we've done just now is we've started to kind of name a bit of the landscape we're in. I've offered us a bit of a spiritual metaphor to think about, and I've offered us a little bit of kind of research-based kind of model of disaster recovery in that time. And we've also done, we've ground ourselves a little bit in sharing some of our experience as well during the pandemic. And as I've been talking to people throughout this period of time and sort of thinking about the impacts and reading into it as well, something that's really helped me come to terms with it is an idea I'm going to introduce, and that's the idea of disrupted rhythms. Now, much of our life is very much built kind of on routines and patterns. And to some degree, even if it's very implicit, the expectation that those routines and patterns will deliver for us, they'll, help us live, they minimize energy that we have to use in some ways. They are the way that we function. Not everything in our lives is patterned, and we will all have different desires and needs of greater levels of these patterns in our lives. But most of us, probably by this time in our life, we probably evolved these things enough for them to be quite healthy and part of how we are and who we live. And there've been things that have been part of how we've been since we arrived on on this earth. And for some of us, we probably found in the pandemic that the loss of a lot of those rhythms it was very destabilizing. Some people may not so much, but for some of us, quite big actually. And for some of us, there may be a kind of element of sort of spiritual gift within some of those patterns. And even kind of for many of us of a faith background, there might be kind of particular spiritual rhythms that have kind of been thrown off, particularly maybe things that were a lot more communal that had to change entirely. So this is the stuff that sort of holds us together. And again, I think for me was one of the most obviously disrupted things. And I would say for myself, kind of, there's also within this disruption, there's occasional gifts. So I remember the first lockdown, if all I can do is go out and exercise once a day, I'm going to go on a really long run, and isn't the weather fantastic? So I managed to get into a mindset where that at that point, at that time, that felt like a gift, So the disruption can bring good things too. It can help us sometimes think differently. It can help us think more creatively about where we are. Again, if we have capacity, and again, that's the thing. So certainly friends of mine, and you may have been in this position as well, who have small school-age children or younger, really big impact trying to manage all of that. Now, everyone's nodding. I think most people have probably known someone who's been in that position, really stretched. And if you were trying to do that and hold down a job, I mean, my goodness, my heart was with you because it was just tough. So not all of that disruption, it can, not all of us have the bandwidth to make the best of that. And you probably, I don't know, there's lots of lockdown cliches, weren't there, of kind of sourdough starter, I've done this many series of such and such and all that kind of stuff. And eventually you started seeing these things appearing on social media of kind of, if someone shares again what they've been baking, I'm gonna, there was all of that, wasn't there? It's just, for some people, just too much. But so the rhythms themselves, as they're disrupted, sometimes good and sometimes very, very difficult to kind of live with. So I'd just kind of, in chat now, I'd just invite you to think about and maybe share what rhythms have held you through the pandemic. What were the things that held you through the pandemic?
I've got two that I can share.
Thank you, Sophie.
One is that my church group carried on meeting, our like midweek group carried on meeting on Zoom on a Tuesday, which for me was such a like foundation that I needed in my faith, and like sustained me through that. And it was almost like a weekly check-in, which was great. And another was a new routine that I developed in lockdown. As you said, I like similarly like to get out and go for lots of walks and things, and try to set up a routine of going for walks in my lunch break and calling friends. So actually it meant that I was like way more connected to friends, because I was ringing them like every like couple of weeks or something to just catch up and find out how they were doing in the lockdown. And actually they're friends that I hadn't spoken to for ages before that. So I definitely think that in that sense, one of the gifts for me for the pandemic was that it brought me a lot closer to many of my friends.
That's really good. Two great examples. Thank you. Thanks. Any others?
I have a slightly similar one, but not completely. So we did the cliche of family Zooming, which then opened out to friends and family. And we still do that like every week. We do like a quiz every week still. And the really lovely thing is it was probably the most we spoke of my brother like in years, not because we don't get along. It's just that he's so busy working. He runs a restaurant, and obviously he had the most time during lockdown, but we now like work out every week kind of when he's free so he can join. And it's just really nice because it's a way to check in with people we don't see all the time. Like I said, it carries on, and everybody laughs at that because everybody else got sick of Zoom quizzes like after the first like month, I think, whereas we're still going like 2.5 years later.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Brilliant. Great. No pressure, but anything else? Great.
We also did a quiz right at the beginning in the first lockdown. My sister's friends managed to be coordinated enough to create a weekly quiz, and like each family would host a week. So it was quite nice to be able to go through and realize, like, pick up on which families created the most difficult quizzes that you couldn't answer. It would be like, who's the 19th person in the credits of Hot Fuzz? And you're like, what? That was one of the questions.
That's a whole new level, isn't it? That
yeah. Whereas the other one's like, oh, what's the name of the cat in something? There was something about a cat that was a lot easier though.
That's amazing.
But, yeah, no, that was a good one, to be able to still feel like you're having a somewhat social event, even though everything's quite distant physically.
That's really good. Well, thank you for sharing those things. We're just going to do, just going to offer another couple of questions on this one. Where are we? Let me find it one more time. So I named that we were kind of in this time of what I've sort of called disrupted rhythms. And here's one of the slides that just goes through that. One of the things I'm aware of is the fact that part of this was that, you know, there were daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and other ways that we were disrupted. And it's quite interesting kind of talking to people about where this hit. I remember talking to somebody about the fact that they went on holiday 6 times a year, and your initial response is like, wow, that's a pretty privileged situation to be able to do that. But then kind of I caught myself in it. I thought, well, if the rest of the time you're just running at everything with such a great rate, to not have that kind of release valve probably felt incredibly disruptive to that individual, even though there was obviously a massive amount of privilege in terms of being able to make that happen. And so that's probably one example of something that, you know, again, you wouldn't notice until after a period wasn't there. And there may be other things that kind of within our calendars that were just markers that we just weren't there anymore. It's like, well, hang on, we always go there every year, or I always do that, or those sorts of things kind of, as well as that, became, you know, a real sign of the fact that things were not, you know, not as they used to be. So I'm sure that we're kind of looking forward to a lot more of some of those things being returning, and maybe some new things to replace as well as we look at this. what I'd like us to do now, and I think this may be one, given the time where we are, we won't spend too long on this, but I just want to offer you a question to think about, and we'll think about these just by ourselves at the moment, and it's on this slide. So as we think about pandemic rhythms, I'd really invite you just to have a quiet moment to think about maybe one particular rhythm or gift, if there wasn't a regular thing, that really held you through the pandemic, and allow yourself to dwell on that. And what I'd encourage you to do is just to kind of think about what was it about that felt like a real gift to me, you know, that one particular thing that I've decided to be, you know, recognize and think about what was it that made that such a gift to me? Why did that resonate so much in this time of difficulty and challenge? Just take a moment to think about that. And then equally, just thinking about this other part of the question. And again, within the space that we have, only spend time with something that feels appropriate for you at the moment. Many of us have been through some really difficult losses during this time. You may choose to kind of revisit that, or you might choose to revisit something that's a smaller loss, but helps you recognize that there have been difficulties and challenges during this time. So have a think about those things, whether it's something cumulative, whether it was an event. Again, something that doesn't feel like it's going to stretch you too far out of your into a place of deep discomfort, but just something you can sit with. And what for you feels important to name as you spend time thinking about that. So I'm just going to leave that with you just for a minute before we then move on. Okay, well, thank you for that. I just want to offer an opportunity if there's anything that people want to comment on in terms of that experience of just thinking about it and reflecting on it that feels helpful to share. But again, no pressure. If it feels like there's something that would be good to share in the group, then it'd be great to hear it. I'm sensing we're going to move on, or is there anyone who's kind of might be heading towards that? Great.
Yeah, I just had one thing, and it kind of was stirred up from the previous slide where you had like daily, weekly, yearly. And my yearly thing is that that Greenbelt, the festival, has not been on for the last couple of years. And the first year in the pandemic, they did like a Greenbelt online, and it was really wonderful. And then I think the second year they did like kind of a mini festival, but I wasn't able to go. And it's back on this summer, and I feel such an immense sense of joy that it's back on. And it's like, just thinking about it now, it's made me reflect on my relationship with Greenbelt, being like a place of true like sanctuary and safety, and that Greenbelt really feels like a home to me that I haven't had access to for the last couple of years. So looking forward, I'm just like really excited that it's back on.
That's really wonderful. We'll celebrate with you, and I'm sure a lot of us will see you there. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. That's really, really well, and so beautifully named as well. Thank you. Great. Anything else, or shall we move on? Okay, I think we're heading to the move on. All right, so we talked a bit about socializing. This is probably one of the least social places in the world, Antarctica. Now, when I was digging in a bit about kind of, are there parallel experiences of this that people have been through? I came across this really interesting study. It's about 2017, and a group of people were sent to work in Antarctica, and they tracked their mood. And what was really interesting within that quite kind of unusual and isolated working environment, where all you've got to do is hang out with the penguins and people you probably wouldn't choose to be with, they found that after a couple of months of being there, people started to exhibit the symptoms of burnout. So things such as low mood, lack of motivation, sleeplessness, lower productivity for longer time worked. These sorts of things kind of are part of that experience of burnout. And it was really interesting. So eventually they got they kind of continued to track these people's mood. And I guess things stabilized to a degree. And then when they went back to their kind of home countries, they still kept tracking their mood. And the thing that they found, which I think is really significant, is how exhausted they were for a number of months with social interactions, having come out of that situation. So I can see some nods here. It's like, finally, we've got some way of kind of gauging what happens. Now, the good news is that did stabilize. And so people's level of normal energy from socializing, and again, obviously we have different capacities and needs depending on our introversion and extroversion, but they found that things did get back to normal. Now, caveat, I think, is that these people were coming out of an unusual environment back into a normal. The difference for us, of course, is that we're still working that out together. So none of us are kind of, have landed and we're back in where everything else has gone on as it were normal. We're still working out. So again, I'm no psychologist, but my sense is that it might take us a bit longer, just because of the fact that it's not like getting on the conveyor belt of life. We're working that out. So just, we'll get there, but there will be an impact, I think, in the way that we've seen here. So really interesting just to kind of draw on that little story. And what I'm bringing, we're kind of going to start to think a bit about our well-being now beyond what we've looked at. We've done a lot of work on context and thought about how we are and what's gone on in the pandemic. What I'd like to do is think a bit about our needs beyond this time, looking forward. And so I'm going to share a slide, which is, it's called the 8 Dimensions of Wellbeing. So Peggy Swarbrick, still around, she's developed one of a number of different research-based models that offer a window into the elements of our lives needed for us to flourish. And so there are a number of things there that probably won't be that surprising. Now, a quick disclaimer, or maybe a caveat, is probably the better way to describe it. You'll see quite a lot of overlap between all of these things. So, for example, for some of us, our spiritual lives are just as much social. It's not necessarily our private kind of spiritual practice that's the main part of how we express our spirituality. There may be other things that cross over with that. And equally, intellectual and occupational, that could be the same space. It may not be. You might do a really mundane job and you get your stimulation elsewhere. But these are, again, it's not looking for necessarily an equal balance of everything, because when we look at those things, there'll be certain things that we're really drawn to and are just very key for us, and other things that probably need to be there to a degree. Financial stability obviously is a foundation of wellness, and not having that worry is going to be massively impactful. But there may, beyond that, there might not be for some of us. That might not be a thing that again, it depends on all kinds of things. Family system we grew up in, personal circumstances, how our values have developed. So it's very individualized. But what it does do is it offers a kind of little window in terms of things that are quite important and common to the human experience. And what I would say on this one is that it would be really interesting just to look. And as we think about maybe our pandemic experience and where we are now, is there one of these things that's standing out as really important for me? Is there one thing there that I'm thinking, I feel like that's just, as I think about maybe my well-being at the moment, where I'm at right now, either something I'm feeling I really value and I'm seeing the benefits of, or on the other hand, actually that feels like it's a bit of a gap that it would be interesting to look at and spend some time considering. So anyone got any thoughts on that? I mean, I know they're really broad categories, but can anyone kind of connect with one of them in a way that feels, maybe meaningful, that relates to perhaps a person, an activity, or or purpose around that? So just open that up for any thoughts as you look at that wheel.
So the thing that jumps out to me is a bit of a cheat because I'm going to say two, but I think they're really connected. It's the physical well-being and wellness, but for me that is mostly about emotional well-being, because so I run a lot, and running for me is my way of like having time to myself, processing what's going on, having a bit of a check-in. I often use that time for prayer as well, so there's some spiritual element there. But when I don't have that time, my well-being really drops, and I feel like I'm really like suffocating because I can't get out. And then as soon as I've been for a run, I feel great again.
Great, real cornerstone for you, very important. Thank you, thanks for naming that. Great. Any other thoughts as we look at that wheel?
I was going to say physical as well, and I was going to say that bled into the emotional and also the social for me. So before the pandemic, and even a bit of the intellectual. So before the pandemic, like when I was doing my PhD, me and my sister used to take time out during the day when one of us was stressed to go to the gym, and like we'd make it like part of our weekly routine. Like we'd make sure we've got to go to classes together, and if one of us was really stressed, like, let's just take some time out. We'll go to a half an hour class. We'll do a half an hour circuit at the gym, and then obviously that stopped very abruptly. And then I kind of went from having that social aspect, being able to go out once a day for half an hour to an hour, and we have a dog. So the only thing we could do really was walk the dog, which was lovely. But for part of that, we couldn't even drive. And when you live in a town with not a lot of places to go, it kind of didn't have the same appeal, especially because the other thing like me and my partner loves to do is go walking. And when you can only go to the river around the back of your house, it kind of got a bit samey.
Yes.
I find it really interesting as well, because like it's literally the weekend, my sister and I, for the first time, we're like, maybe we should go back to the gym. Like we both started to feel like that COVID kind of anxiety was lessening, because like about 3 months ago we were still like, no way, it feels far too dangerous. So I don't know again if that's part of the kind of coming out of the other side and they're being able to feel like you can plan some stability. But yeah, the physical really jumped out at me, but for all those other reasons as well.
Really helpful. It's interesting, isn't it, how one thing kind of connects to lots of others in many cases really quite quickly. Thank you. Great. Any other thoughts on that wheel? Any other kind of things sparked as we look at that? It's fine if not. We've got a few minutes. So what I'd be interested in thinking about now, just to plant the seed of this, if you think about where you're at now in your pandemic journey, so to speak, it sounds quite grand, doesn't it? I've named it that without your permission. That's what I'm calling it. I'd be really interested if you were to start to think about, okay, what if I'm really thinking quite seriously about where I am and perhaps, how I flourish well. Is there something new that might be a clue within this that feels like it's inviting me forward? So I'm just going to plant the seed of that question, and we're going to dig into it in a moment. And before we do that, I'm going to reflect a little bit again from some biblical imagery that I hoped might feel a little bit congruent to thinking ahead and restoring rhythms. So it's a really simple slide here. It's from, I was thinking about kind of John 15 and Jesus's drawing on this imagery of him being the vine and us being the branches. And within this setting, we've got him drawing from what I think is a really kind of rich picture of what it means to be centered in God and being in the rhythms of God. If you think about the way that a vine grows, because of where it's rooted, it happens very naturally in its growth and how the fruit comes from it, so there's a beautiful and quite rich metaphor that he's offering there. And in John 15, he says, I'm the true vine and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so it'll be ever more fruitful. And so that sense in which kind of it offered to me, I suppose, that rather than a kind of must rebuild life, must kind of find a way of making good on all the things it lost, actually, what would it be instead to enter into a new rhythm that was drawn from a deeper spiritual place, you know. And what's really interesting is kind of as Jesus talks through that picture of him as the vine and the branches, he then goes on to this incredibly profound statement where he says, I no longer call you servants, because the servant doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends, for everything I learned from my Father I've made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so you might go and bear fruit that will last. And so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command. Love each other. And again, it's that sense of like, those things flow from God, who God has called us to be, and we're able to see ourselves reflected in him. Then there's something of a gift in that. And the kind of that intimacy that Jesus talks about in terms of calling us friends in that way is something that's really deep and rich. And it just started to point me towards that idea of kind of, that's the very opposite of the survival mode, you know. It's the very opposite of kind of not being able to kind of see where the horizon is and needing the kind of comfort of the pillar of fire and the cloud of smoke. Instead, it's coming into a place where we're once again re-entering the natural rhythms that are available and offered to us. So there's a deep simplicity in that metaphor in a way. But, you know, that recognition and in that picture of God being the root of all things, and that flourishing, potentially being able to kind of enter into lots of areas of our lives. So I just want to offer that as almost a background image as we think about the next thing and the potential invitation that may be being made on us at this time. So what I'd like to do is, just for the last couple of minutes, and this may be that something that we need to return back to, is I'm going to offer two choices. One of the choices will be for you to look at doing some work with thinking about what a new restored rhythm will look like for you. And I've got some questions for you on that. If that at the moment you honestly in your heart you're thinking, you know what, I think I'm done. What I'd like to do is just offer a few minutes in silence where you just think through, you know, prayerfully perhaps, where am I at right now, and you know, what might be landing for me from this. So I'm just going to move to the slide, which here we go. There we are. One is, I guess, that process that you might want to look at if you're thinking about restoring a rhythm. So this is very much about moving forward. This is where I'm at, but where I'd like to be. And thinking just to yourself through that process. Or you might just want to sit in silence and reflect on what you need to. So either of those things are good, and I hope might reflect that kind of image that we've been offered through the vine and the branches as we sit here now. So we're just going to give you a moment, just a minute, and then what I'd like to do is end with the blessing. And just for the sake of our time now, I'll move on. But you might choose to return to those questions at some point if you want to. They're things that may be of use. Again, anything in this session, there may be even just one thing that lands. There might be something else. It doesn't have to be that. But it's there for you if you'd like to run with it. I just want to, on that note, really quickly, just offer a moment, just in case anyone in the room right now wants to just say anything that's kind of landed for them from this time. Again, if there's nothing that's springing to mind, that's fine. Is there anything that's kind of, that feels that's been something of a moment or a thought that they're going to be taking away from this time that we've had together?
I guess very simply, an answer to the third question, what do I expect will be the outcome of this? And for me, building rhythms is about gaining more peace. And I think that's what jumped out to me.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Great. Any other thoughts on this final exercise, or the whole time that we've had together, of anything that's landed during it? We've had almost an hour now, more than I expected to do, but there's been so many good comments and really great engagement from you all. So thank you. Anything else that might be landing?
The question of why it's important to me as well is about kind of a bit about taking back control and feeling like, I don't know if control is the right answer, and that sounds very kind of Brexity. I didn't mean it like that, but like some kind of personal control, and also kind of a stress release, because I feel like I've not been able to channel the stresses that I have in a healthy way, or the way that I usually would have done pre-pandemic for such a long time. I really value the fact that I could take that back and be able to do that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. There's something about just having that time for you to process a bit, just so you've kind of got enough of a hook on something that you think, okay, that is the thing that's important to me at the moment. Thank you. Great.
Looking at like bullet point 3 as well, it's just a sort of about building back a little bit of joy, because lots of people are living sort of below the line of contentment, or on contentment, which is good. It's good to be content, but I think sometimes we forget to be happy as well. We get very familiar with being content or just below it, maybe just above it, but actually sometimes it's good to be joyful as well, to feel things more, bad things and good things. So I think it's also the rhythm
way to talk about this experience, because as you say, there's kind of been so you don't say it, but it feels like what's implied in your statement is that there's been a bit of a flattening of our emotions. And so that sense in which, we're engaging in things with an expectation of more fullness of them it sounds like a great thing to name. Thank you. Well, I've really enjoyed the time that we've had, and I'd just like to finish with this blessing that I'm just going to say over all of us as we head out this evening. Eternal One, from whom our words come, questioner from whom our questions arise, lover of whom all our loves are hints, disturber in whom alone we find our rest, mystery in whose depths we find healing and ourselves. Enfold us now in your presence. Restore to us your peace. Renew us through your power, and ground us in your grace. Amen. Well, thank you for the time, everybody, and I hope you have a fantastic spring when it fully arrives. It's been great to be with you.
Thank you very much, Corin. Just a quick question. I guess if anybody had any questions based on anything, anybody who's not been able to attend tonight, anybody had any questions based on anything that they see in this presentation, is there somewhere you would direct them to go to?
Thank you. Yes, I really appreciate that. Let me just share a quick slide of where you can get information about all of this. You can contact me, and you can do that through this route. Let me just show you. Just do a quick slide share again, once more time. I've just realised I didn't press the slide share button. Won't be a moment, we'll get there. Last job. Okay, so there we are, brilliant. So this will help you get in contact with me. There's a route to do that through the website. I'm really happy to share anything that we've done here. For the slides are useful for people to do. If you are into QR codes, that'll get you there quickly. And I'd love for you to stay in touch. So if you would like to check out some of the resources that we have, there are a number of different things around wellbeing. Very briefly, we produced an app that was looking at I guess trying to keep the conversation around wellbeing live while things were getting heavy. It just felt really important to talk about our experiences. Some of the things we've touched on tonight are in there, and it's a free app that you can download. So that's there and available. And that's all the rest of the stuff on the site. So yeah, do check it out, and please do contact me. I'm really happy to help and respond if I can, and love these conversations. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Corin. It's been really useful. At least I found it really useful. And thank you, Sophie and Alana, as well, for being so talkative as well and feeding back. And I'm just gonna